Henry's World Tour. Story and pictures by Robert Quackenbush. One morning, Henry the Duck woke up and saw a speckled feather growing from his tail. He wondered how he got it. He called his friend Clara. He had been over at her house for dinner the night before. They saw each other often and told each other everything.
You should check your roots, Henry,
said Clara.
Maybe one of your ancestors had speckled feathers.
Henry knew that his ancestors came from all over the world. He had cousins living in many different countries. He decided to go visit some of them to find out where he got his speckled feather. Henry traveled across the great Atlantic Ocean to visit his British cousins in London. They took him to see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. Henry tried so hard to peer through the fence that his head got stuck between two bars. He had to be wrestled free. Poor Henry left England with a pinched head, a sore neck, and no leads about his speckled feather. Next, Henry crossed the North Sea to the Netherlands. While sightseeing with his Dutch cousins, he got caught in a whirling windmill. Not only that, the tulips everywhere gave him hay fever. Quack! Choo! He left his cousins with a runny beak and no facts about where his speckled feather came from. Henry traveled on to France to visit cousins in Paris. They went to dine at Maxim's, but Henry tripped and fell smack into the desserts. Apricot tarts and chocolate mousse went flying all over. Henry ended up with mousse in his face and not a hint about his speckled feather. Henry went south to sunny Spain to see cousins who worked at a bull ring. Poor Henry went through the wrong gate. He got chased by a bull and poked by a picadilla. Picked and poked was all Henry got. His cousins had no tips to give him about his speckled feather. High on the mighty Alps of Switzerland, Henry got involved with a bunch of yodeling relatives. Quack a lady who! They nearly burst Henry's eardrums. On top of that, they never heard of ancestors with speckled feathers. Onward, Henry traveled to the far north of Finland. He visited cousins who were into health and fitness. Try our sauna, they said. They roasted him in a hothouse and then threw him in an ice pond. They knew all about keeping in shape, but they knew nothing about Henry's speckled feather. Henry's next stop was the USSR to visit his Russian cousins in Moscow. They also could shed no light on his speckled feather, but they loved him so they tossed him in the air and spun him around until his eyes crossed. Worn out, Henry headed for Italy, hoping for some peace and quiet. No such luck. His Italian cousins were so glad to see him that they partied loudly and stuffed him full of pasta. But they had no news to give him about his speckled feather. Crossing the Mediterranean Sea, Henry landed in Egypt. While he was taking pictures of the pyramids, a camel came and sat on him. Henry left his cousins squished and squashed and with no family history about his speckled feather. Down to the equator in East Africa went Henry. His cousins in Kenya took him on a photo safari. Horrors! Henry was nearly gobbled up by a lion. Weak and trembling, Henry left Africa, too, with nothing to tell Clara about his speckled feather. Henry crossed the Arabian Sea to India. His cousins gave him a turban to wrap around his head. But Henry got himself wrapped up instead. Even worse, his cousins had no records of ancestors with speckled feathers. Henry went below the equator to Australia. In the vast outback country, he was chased by a mob of kangaroos. One of the mothers thought Henry was kidnapping her baby, but the baby was kidnapping him. Fortunately, Henry's cousins came to his rescue, but they had no idea where he got his speckled feather. Henry headed north to visit cousins in Hong Kong. After an 18-dish meal, he went for a ride in a rickshaw. Big mistake. Henry was bounced about so in heavy traffic that he got a terrible tummy ache. Pea-green and dizzy, he left his cousins without even a clue about his speckled feather. Arriving in Japan, Henry was given a kimono and wooden shoes called geta. During a tea ceremony, he forgot to leave his shoes outside the door. He tripped on his kimono and crashed into a valuable tea set. Limping and hobbling, Henry left his cousins with a twisted ankle and no information about his speckled feather. Henry traveled across the mighty Pacific Ocean to South America to visit cousins in Brazil. Goodness! Such excitement! They kept him dancing the samba and the lambada until he threw his hip out of joint. But they couldn't tell him anything about his speckled feather. At last Henry headed for home. Sore and worn out as he was, he went to Clara's house and told her everything that had happened.
But Henry,
Said Clara,
I found out about your speckled feather after you left. Remember when you were having dinner at my house the night before you noticed the feather? Well, I found out that you sat on a chair I freshly painted. The end.